Facebook Live, Twitter Live, and YouTube Live. Let's move forward. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we're discussing water rights and access to clean water for Native Americans on tribal lands with special guests. John Echohawk, Executive Director of the Native American Rights Fund, who has been representing American Indian tribes in their water right claims for more than 50 years. And George McGraw, founder and CEO of DigDeep, which is dedicated to providing clean running water to all Americans, including the Navajo Nation. So thank you so much for joining us. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we'll take 3 snap polls during the show, announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. John, it's great to see you again. It always is. You know, I sit at your feet and learn about a world that I have only touched tangentially, and it's such an honor to be able to benefit from your experience. As a man of European descent, it's really important for me to understand the impact that my forebears have had on yours, and to try and find a way to together build a much better and more just society. And we're going to be talking about water rights in that context. Water is so important, particularly throughout the United States. And I had not been aware until very recently the impact that our history has had on Native tribes and access to water. Could you help me to understand better the situation that you face in Indian country?
Yes, well, as you know, Mark, it's very important out here in the West, where water is scarce, to have access to water and rights to water, because you just can't survive, without the water. And so the issues are really important to tribes. There are so many tribes out West, and fortunately, they've got substantial rights to water, and that's what we've been helping them with for the last 52 years here at the Native American Rights Fund, the National Indian Legal Defense Fund.
What is the source of those rights? Are those rights embedded in past treaties that were forged with the various nations?
Well, it all stems from a United States Supreme Court decision in 1908 that for the first time addressed tribal water rights. And the Supreme Court in that case dealt with a situation where the Indians on the reservation were not getting water that they needed because it was being diverted upstream by non-Indians. And so the court had to decide who had the rights. And the court basically held that tribes had the senior rights, that under their treaty, even though it didn't say specifically anything about water, the treaty impliedly reserved water for present and future uses for the Indians, because without water, the reservation would be useless. So surely there must have been water reserved by Congress when it passed the treaty, even though the treaty didn't say anything specific about it. So this is known as the Winter's Doctrine, reserve rights for tribes that were established at the time the reservation was created. And we've been is representing tribes to quantify, figure out exactly how much water that is.
And one thing that really struck me, I was talking with someone who represents a major part of the American farming industry and ranching industry. And he basically said the following, which I thought was very interesting. He said, when you have a vegetable, when you have a piece of fruit, when you look at a steak, what you're basically looking at from a Western point of view is water. is water, right? It's water in a tangible form. The food is grown by water. It's actually, it's money, it's life, it's value. And so before the Supreme Court decision, there was a taking of value, taking of life in this respect as well. And George, you're focused on providing access to that life-giving thing that we all need on a daily basis. So talk a little bit about how you approach this issue once the rights are established.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Good morning, Mark. Nice to see you, John. Really excited to talk about this today. It's World Water Day, being celebrated all over the world. And John pointed out the Winters Doctrine. I wish, Mark, that had been, the end of the problem, that tribal water rights had been respected from there on out. But unfortunately, in this country and in others, there are these legacies of broken treaties and unrecognized rights, and tribes really having to step up to the plate, often with fewer resources than states or the federal government, to defend their rights, even the ones that are explicitly recognized in treaties. But basically, what we have today is a situation in which there are millions, more than 2.2 million people in the US who don't have access to running water or a flush toilet.
2.2 million people.
Yeah, exactly.
Are those regionally focused? And talk a little bit about the dimensions that hit Native Americans.
Yeah, so our organization, DigDeep.org, and the US Water Alliance released a report in 2019. It was the first effort to try to quantify this population, where they live, to understand the drivers of the problem. And we found that these 2.2 million folks, which is likely an undercount, live in all 50 states, but that race is the strongest predictor of whether or not you and your family will have a tap or a toilet in your house. And, to us on this call, it would be unsurprising to know that Native Americans, indigenous folks, are 19 times more likely than white families not to have running water today. If you're Black or Latino, you're twice as likely. And so the largest concentrations of folks that we have without running water are Alaskan Natives, Native Americans living in Arizona, in New Mexico. But really, this does affect Native and non-Native folks in all 50 states. But Native reservations have been hit the hardest. We work on the Navajo Nation, which is the largest reservation. It's in the Southwest, and there almost 30% of folks don't have running water.
Almost a third of people don't have access to running water, John. And that is it's just insane. And it's all defined by race.
Yes, it is. And we've done our best here over 52 years to help tribes quantify their rights under the Winters Doctrine, such that then they would have access to that water. It would be wet water, not paper water, which the paper says it was impliedly reserved for them. But exactly how much that is, and then to put that to use, that's a whole nother problem. That's a whole nother situation. And we've made a lot of progress on that. But still, there's more tribes, more work to do.
And George, how do you actually bridge that gap? Because you're talking about logistics, you're talking about technology, you're talking about engineering. So describe that and describe the teams, because also you want to create self-sufficiency as well. You don't want to create codependency. And frankly, the tribes are very cautious, justifiably, from any codependent relationship. So talk about how you go about the logistics of creating a solution.
Absolutely. So John's absolutely right. Our job is to take those paper rights and turn them into wet rights and actually get this water into people's homes where they can use it. And that is an effort that we do alongside tribal governments and tribal utilities themselves. But we really focus on usually those really remote or hard to serve homes that are outside of existing infrastructure. So the tribal government is often focused on extending utility lines to service as many people as possible, or making those systems more robust, using money from water rights settlements, using new water as it comes into the system as they win these settlements. We really focus on the fringes, bringing hot and cold running water and sanitation to folks in remote areas. One of those efforts of ours is the Navajo Water Project. And that is a completely indigenous-led effort. It's led by my colleague, Emma Robbins, who's Diné herself. Actually, all of our projects doing infrastructure work around the country are led by directors and managers from the communities they serve and employ people from within that community too, and build, jobs and
Basically,
economic
the
wealth.
deciders on the ground are the people on the ground.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's why I have the time to be with you here today, because I'm not on the ground making those decisions.
So in terms of, so you create these teams, you're creating these projects. Could you talk a little bit about the subject matter expertise beyond the project management side and the on the ground side? There's technology involved, right? I mean, water, creating this infrastructure requires some things that you couldn't train me today to learn in a short period of time. How do you assemble those teams?
You'd be surprised what you can learn on YouTube, Mark. But
no, well,
yeah,
that's a
this
very
is
good
a little
point. It's a very good point, right?
Yeah, there are certainly, and that is part of our job. Water is so multifaceted. I think there's part of this, it's about deploying technology. And we have a host of, plumbers and pipe fitters and solar technicians and engineers on board. And, they're focused on deploying these systems. We build off-grid systems where in remote homes that can't be reached by water lines, we'll install systems that store thousands of gallons of water underground safely that we might deliver by truck, for instance, using a network of community truck drivers. And then we'll use solar power to pump that water into the house and to heat it and to pressurize it into, sinks and showers and toilets. In some places, we help the utility reach out to and hook up families who are close to utility lines, but might not have the time or the resources or the expertise to know, how to get in that line and what paperwork to put forward and how to finalize that transaction. In some cases, we're building, septic and sanitation systems. People might already have running water, but not have the infrastructure in their house to have a toilet, for instance. I think one of the coolest things we do, to my point about YouTube, we have a new partnership with IAPMO, which is the big plumbing code writing organization in the US, and with Navajo Technical University. And we just during COVID built a plumbing and pipe fitting training lab that will train and graduate the first class of Navajo plumbers and pipe fitters. And if they go through this program for a year and a half, they'll get a certificate that allows them to do plumbing and pipe fitting work on the nation. And they'll use DigDeep's Navajo Water Project as sort of a living classroom out in the field. And then with that certificate, they can either continue to practice plumbing and pipe fitting on the Navajo Nation, where, to my knowledge, right now, in an area the size of the state of West Virginia, there's only one licensed Navajo plumber. Everyone else has to find a plumber, often a non-native plumber from off the reservation, to come do that work if they can. And with that certificate, they can work on the nation, or they can apprentice with one of the national plumbing unions in any state and build a really valuable business. I mean, the trades are so under-resourced in the US, but so essential moving forward, especially in the face of climate change. And this is an incredible opportunity for young Indigenous folks to step up and build wealth.
John, could you give us a little bit of an insight into how the civil society within diverse tribes work? And I know that it's an unfair question because there's so many different nations, there's so many different approaches, so many different people, and so on. But we're outsiders. I'm an outsider, and we have. My experience has been I've worked with foundations, tribal foundations. I've worked with tribal governments. I've worked with nonprofits. Give us a sense of how people come together, different groups of people within a tribe or across tribes, to forge a productive relationship that leads to self-sufficiency and in a way that is determined by the people themselves. Is there a lot of discussion and interaction and debate? Are people individually taking flyers, or all of the above?
No, this is an issue that's very important to tribes. We have a symposium on tribal water rights settlements every 2 years,
okay,
to bring everybody up to speed on all the latest developments. And it's always really very well attended by tribes, because tribes know that they all have these reserved water rights under the Winners Doctrine, and they're all working together to get those rights quantified through litigation or settlements. And everybody's on the same page, and we've really come a long way since the 70s, when all this litigation started under our leadership, and there are 34 congressionally approved water rights settlements. We've been involved in 9 of those at the Native American Rights Fund, and there are currently 20 sets of negotiations underway to quantify the reserve rights under the Winters Doctrine, and tribes are universally in support of the settlement policy, and the administration of Congress knows that very well. That tribes.
How do the different peoples and negotiators handle the non-federally recognized tribes versus the federally recognized tribes? Because there's a different set of issues, right? For those that are federally versus non-federally recognized?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So how do the federally recognized, because my understanding is the federally recognized tribes have more leverage, and particularly if there are particular treaties involved. But my understanding is that as a group that very often the rights of the federally recognized tribes are also leveraged to try and support, in certain respects, the aspirations of the non-federally recognized tribes. Am I getting that incorrect? I know that there are people involved, so there are politics involved and different views and so on. How does that function in a way that supports everyone's aspirations?
Well, of course, the federal government owes no trust responsibility to the non-federally recognized tribes, so they're basically on their own. They're in a different mode than the federally recognized tribes, and it's just really not anything that we're working on, and I just really don't think there's a whole lot of conflict there in the water rights field between the federally recognized and the non-recognized.
Okay. So we just completed a poll. We asked, what is the most critical factor in determining water access in the U.S.? And we had race and ethnicity got 38% of the response. Income got some response, a little bit above 10%. But all of the above, race, ethnicity, income, and location, were viewed as intersecting issues. How do you feel about this, George, in terms of income? You know, our income in this country so often correlates to ethnicity, right? Average incomes for different peoples are very much correlated to race. Is this an income issue? Is it a location issue? Is it an all of the above issue, or is it a race issue?
It is an all of the above issue, but sort of in order of precedence, it's race, then income, then location. And you're right that those are really.
Why is it race first?
Well, I think, if you look at the history of how we invested in water infrastructure in this country, starting with the New Deal in the 1930s, we made massive investments to bring water and sanitation services.
Tennessee Valley Authority, right?
Yeah, even the most rural parts of this country. We had, in fact, a federal authority that was just set up to serve rural populations of 1,000 people or less. Of course, what you don't read in history books is that those were set up to serve predominantly white rural populations. And the idea was that we would eradicate cholera and other waterborne illnesses and support farmers. But those investments, either deliberately or accidentally, in some cases, bypassed places like native reservations and communities of color. Sometimes
Black
those communities
farmers,
of color,
Latino farmers did not get the same consideration.
That's exactly right. In fact, there was a really interesting article in 2019 in the New York Times about a farm town in California. A lot of freed Black slave families had moved from southern plantation states out to California to start a new life and have a new opportunity, but Jim Crow beat them here. And so they settled, unable to live in the center of these farm towns, they settled their own neighborhoods on the side of these farm towns, often, across the tracks, on the other side of the tracks. And when the federal government came in and built water infrastructure, they didn't build it to serve these predominantly Black communities. And now what you have today is most of those Black families have left and been replaced by Latino farm working families. And in some towns in California, you still have parts of that town that have running water, being the predominantly white and traditionally white parts, and other, whole neighborhoods simply not being served. And that's, in 2022.
Now, how does that work in terms of the intersection of politics? Because if wealth correlates to race and services correlates to influence, voters theoretically can shift influence. Is there an issue here in terms of how do we communicate with the government that nonprofits can fill by finessing that communication and providing solutions that are not necessarily coming directly from the government, George?
Well, I mean, you have to remember that in the case of Native Americans, Indigenous folks couldn't vote until the 1960s. So there was no power at the poll box to get politicians to pay attention. And often, Indigenous reservations tend to be, less dense population-wise and sort of more economically depressed than other regions because of policies like this one. And that leads to a situation where, not only are families, forgotten and marginalized, but even if they want to participate in processes like that, they often have much bigger daily needs to think about. If you wake up, Mark, every morning thinking, how will I get enough water for my family to survive the day, just to simply do the activities that I have planned today, it's difficult to think about how to exert influence on someone, half a continent away. And I think that on one of my first trips to Navajo, I met this woman named Brenda Johnson, who I'm still friends with. And, her family didn't have running water. And I rode a water truck, this woman named Darlene Arviso, this Navajo school bus driver who would deliver water after her morning bus route. And when we got to Brenda's house, she grabbed a cooking pot, filled it with water, ran into the kitchen and started making tamales. I was like, oh, this is so nice. Are you going to have people over for dinner? And she said, no, I'm going to make these tamales with this clean water. I'm going to put them in this cooler. I'm going to walk down the hill with my little license and I'm going to sell them. And I use that money to get gas money. And I need gas money because my husband, who's the primary breadwinner, he was injured in an accident 50 miles away in Gallup. And we couldn't care for his wound at home. So it got gangrene and he's been in the hospital for 2 weeks. But actually, he was discharged 10 days ago and has been living on the streets because no clean water meant no gas money, and no gas money meant no tamales, and no tamales meant no gas money, and no gas money meant I couldn't go get my husband. And you see how this sort of cycle of economic marginalization, has impacted now generations of Indigenous folks and left them in this situation we're in today.
John, when you have people who are trying to serve, who are white, witness this and bring this awareness, what is? Are we doing the right thing? Are we approaching this properly? Can we do more? And what could we do more to create the America that we imagine that we live in?
Well, we came together recently with the passage of this bipartisan infrastructure bill in Congress, and it provided $2.5 billion to fund these tribal water rights settlements that have not been completely funded yet. $2.5 billion, that was huge. Plus another, I think it was 22 million altogether. 22 billion altogether for clean water programs on reservations. So all of that is finally appropriated. The money's supposed to start flowing. They're starting to basically fulfill the water rights settlements and to provide safe drinking water on a lot of the reservations. So this is just starting. It took a long time to get their attention, but they came through.
It strikes me that in forging these agreements in past history with the nations, often under duress, it created the foundation for other people to build wealth. But there was an agreement for that. There was a quid pro quo, but it seems like it was always quid, 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 right? In other words, continued extraction. This is basically fulfilling an agreement, an exchange, instead of just taking to fulfill the other part of the bargain, isn't it?
Yeah, we've always had difficulty getting the appropriations we need for these water issues. But again, recently we have done pretty well, but it's been a long time in coming.
And are the nations going to be administering the money that is set aside? Because we also have a history of money being set aside and then being administered outside of the nations, taking away the decision-making over the resources that are being allocated. How is it working now?
Well, it's just starting to happen now, and the tribes very much are involved in that process, and are seeking more funding to help them put this money to use for the projects. So they still haven't given up. We still need more help.
You know, to John's point, Mark, I think one of the most exciting things about the infrastructure laws, about 3.5 of that 22 billion that John talked about, that goes directly to the Indian Health Service. Since the 1970s, IHS, which is a division of Health and Human Services, has kept a list called their Sanitation Facilities Construction List that shows every one of the projects on a federally recognized tribal reservation that needs funding for water and sanitation. Everything from, you know, like a treatment plant to a community bathroom. And they've kept this list, and for generations now, to John's point, Congress has only appropriated a small amount, I think at most maybe 4% of the list, not even enough to keep up with the growth in the list year over year. And this bipartisan infrastructure bill, the IIJA, is really exciting because Congress just funded and has now appropriated the funds for that entire backlog, that whole 3.5 billion, which now IHS has the giant job of trying to wipe out over the next 5 years with the help of tribal government, and holding government, you know, accountable and responsible. There's some incredible people in these agencies, but holding them responsible and helping ensure that this money gets where it's needed and that these projects get completed is a really important thing. It's not enough just to pass the bill. We have to pay attention now. We have to support tribes in this work and give them the flexibility they need. I think one of the constant tragedies when we look at federal funding is that federal dollars can't be used on operations and maintenance for water systems. It can only be used to build new water systems or build new connections. And, you know, we know from the IHS's own research that every dollar we invest in a water system in Indian country creates $20 in economic benefit by just reducing disease. And helping people, you know, go to work and go to school. And, you know, if that's true, if for every dollar we invest, we get 20 back on native reservations, we really should be looking at more flexible ways of funding and trusting these tribes with the money and with the appropriations they need to do that work.
You know, it strikes me that the appropriations process is so much also about power and independence, right? You know, there's the old saw about starving the beast, meaning don't fund government. But in this respect, if you take a look at the various nations and you look at the fact that these are independent governments or semi-independent governments, we fund states and we empower local government, and local government empowers itself through this sort of exchange of wealth. But if you starve the beast, and the beast that you're talking about is a tribal government, basically you're disempowering. And so you're empowering certain people, you're choosing who to empower, you're choosing who to disempower. And then you promulgate a system which we're looking at just statistically looks completely unjust, right? I mean, it's on the face of it, it doesn't matter if you're white looking on, black looking on, native looking on, Latino, you know, diverse Asian communities. You just look at this and it just looks unjust. So we're coming to the end of our time here. George, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to leave it with John and give you the last word. How do we solve this issue, George, so that, and I'll just look at the Navajo Nation as an example. How do we resolve this so that we do not have 30% of the members of the Navajo Nation without a tap or running water within homes? How do we deal with that?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. I think the first step is to acknowledge that we have this massive water access gap in the U.S. and build some collective will to solve it. Do we also acknowledge that
we have a collective obligation to fix it?
Yeah, that's exactly the second half of that thought, that we do have an obligation to solve it. And, you know, that will require the federal government and legislators stepping up and recognizing this as a problem and putting legislation in place to solve it. But I think, you know, if we're really going to solve it, especially on a place like Navajo, to your point and to John's today, it's really going to be about putting these communities back in the center of decision making. You know, other communities, predominantly white communities throughout our nation's history, have been given the funding and the license and the decision making power to lead this process themselves, and to say, like, we need this access and this system in this place. And it's created, to your point, a tremendous amount of wealth, often extractive wealth. And what we need today is to, put these same impacted communities, whether it's a tribal community or a rural white community in Appalachia, or a Latino farm working community along the US-Mexico border, we need to put them back in the driver's seat and give them the same access to unfettered resources like grant, not loan money, and money for operations and maintenance that we did to predominantly white communities for the last 100 years.
So part of this systems change is a change in ourselves, recognizing the rights of others. John, we also have other aspects of the system change. It's not only about goodwill, it's about power and orchestrated change that changes institutions. What other advice do you have for us in terms of how all of us together can create the country that we want to have?
Well, we've got momentum now with the bipartisan infrastructure bill that we talked about. We just need to build on that, and we're doing that. There's funds for operation and maintenance that George referred to. That's very, very important. So we're all working on that now, and hopefully we'll be successful in Congress. It's just too bad that it took the COVID epidemic to point out all these problems in Indian country with access to water. But we've got their attention now, and we need to follow up and turn that attention into more support for our tribal communities.
We're all bound together as one nation, right? I mean, and that we tolerate a lack of access to clean water is something that doesn't speak well of those of us who have access to water. John Echohawk, Executive Director of the Native American Rights Fund, and George McGraw, Founder and CEO of DigDeep, thank you so much for helping us to understand this very complex problem, but a problem with a solution. John, your ideas, George, your ideas are just so instructive, and please thank your staffs, your boards, your peoples, and those who support and fund you for helping to make this day possible. Thank you so much. Everybody stay safe. And incidentally, on Thursday, we're going to be talking about a totally different topic, totally different. It's going to be about the science and treatment of a type of cancer, colorectal cancer, which is the third largest cancer killer in the United States, and it affects predominantly as well African American and Native American population. So please stay tuned on Thursday. Thank you all, John, George. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mark.
Have a great day.